Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Today we are doing part two of our series on C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man, The Way. And C.S. Lewis sort of he opens this up with, what's the purpose of the Green Book? I mean, why write this at all, right? Because if everything is just sentiment, is just subjective feelings, and those are therefore meaningless, why write it at all? And so what C.S. Lewis says is, well, they really do think there are some things that matter, but what he's going to attempt to demonstrate is that they don't have any means by which to justify these behavior. And one of the reasons why he focuses on death within the context of dying for the country and as a soldier is that any sort of self-interested rationalization for the preservation of the species or the group is ipso facto impossible to actualize if you're dead. And so why, well, for example, it might be understandable to understand why someone would act upon their instinct, their biological instinct for sex or for food or for sleep, because theoretically they could continue to enjoy that. But why would they act on the biological instinct of preserving the species if in so doing it means that they would die? And he argues that, well, there really is no case that they can make. They could say, well, okay, that's true. Maybe somebody should die, but why is it me? Well, why isn't it you? Um, and he sort of comes to the conclusion that the Green Book has pretty much made it impossible to argue that altruism or selfishness are any more or less reasonable, because neither one is really reasonable at all, because reason isn't really a tool that will help us understand uh, practical morality, practical reason. So, Logos, what are some of your thoughts on this part?
Yeah, I mean that you rolled up a whole bunch of ideas all at once into that summary. So I wanna take them apart for a second and talk about them piece by piece. Um, so the first thing I want to note is when Lewis talks about the motivations of the people that write the book. I mean, Lewis is already kind of using the subjective language in his description when he says they think the Green Book is good for something. Now, Lewis tries to say, well, they must think something in the Green Book is good for its own sake, but I don't know if that follows. If they think they have a reason for writing a Green Book, they have something they want to teach society, they have something they hope society emulates, and it just seems to me that on the basis of that, that would be sufficient for them just trying to do something like in the Green Book. Like a lot of people do terrible things. Serial killers, for example, might not be, tricked into thinking that their serial killing is good for its own sake. They just do it because they want to. Now we can ask the second order question is, okay, well, do they think it's good that they think it's that, the thing they're doing is good for its own sake? But that gets us back to the original question. Good in virtue of what? Well, in virtue of the Tao, but that's a thing under discussion. So it doesn't seem to me that you can so easily kind of rope them in to strong armor them into forcing themselves into some objective standard. The next place Lewis goes is instinct. I just didn't like somebody who's read some Veblen and other people who really, think carefully about the idea of instincts and institutions and cultures. I think he was a little bit too glib and too quick to describe what instinct is. So I have a note here. Yeah. So he says that his first description of instincts is, things that aren't known. I think that's actually more apt to describe what's going on here than his second one, where he says, instincts are impulses which are widely felt by members of a species. And there's two reasons for this. One, when discussing, say, the concept of free will or any sort of mental states, there's all sorts of traditions going back to Kant and the pragmatists we brought up recently, where people will do something, they'll act on impulse in a situation, but if you could figure out and explain exactly why they were doing what they've done, you'd have to use some data, which requires an interpreter and so forth. There's all sorts of transcendental arguments that there's something at root unknowable by the light of reason, which motivates people to do what they do. And so Veblen himself, for example, talks about this as mutually conflicting instincts in each human being, and some might have some instincts more than other ones. So humans can have the instinct of idle curiosity, and if that overwhelms them, they're the types of people that'll be drawn to academic interests. Some will have the instinct of protectors or predators, and so they might be drawn to the military or the police, depending on how you interpret the instincts. And so it just seems to me that the instincts aren't really a prescriptive notion like Lewis is trying to make them out to be, like I have this instinct, therefore I ought. I think it's more primal than that, in the sense that people just do things and do very different things. You get a group of people together and there's something intrinsic about them that draws them to different interests, whether they be academic or military or fitness, physical fitness or something like that. Um, and so instincts are a way to like catalog those drives and desires different in a group of people. Um, and so I thought a lot of his conversation about instincts there was a little bit off base. I think that if you want to talk about how instincts are the motivations for values and why people do what they do, I think a better place to start would be something more like Jonathan Haidt's work, where even if everybody accepts the values in the Tao, like we talked about last time, there's a lens by which they act through them. What does it mean to honor one's dead? What does it mean to defend one's country? What does it mean to? And there's values, people have, freedom, cleanliness, and there's like a whole list. It's been forever since I read The Righteous Mind. I have to go back and pick it back up. It seems more relevant now than ever. But there's these values that people seem to hold in different mixtures that seem to just predict what they're gonna do based on those values. And there is no ultimate, more fundamental line of reasonableness to why they hold the values, it seems, because that starts getting into the Kantian pragmatist, question about free will. If you can predict as an empirical matter just what people are going to do 100% of the time, and there's some empirical reason people do what they do, that gets into like the mind-brain duality problem and all sorts of other crazy things. So again, I'm just going to end with the comment so other people can talk, that Lewis has stepped into quite a minefield of a bunch of intersecting philosophical problems, and he seems to have just kind of like dove right in the middle of it without the care to take apart the layers and make sure things are reasonable.
I guess one thing I would add before I pass this on to Right Ruminations is, obviously Jonathan Haidt wasn't alive when Lewis wrote this. Veblen was already dead, though I don't know how well Veblen was known at the time. How much of this would you say is just the kind of material you're referring to wasn't that well known in 1943?
That's a good question. A lot of it. And I'm not saying that, it's just like wrong of Lewis for not have knowing this stuff. I would say that, for example, Kant and the pragmatists were well known by then, because you had Charles Sanders Peirce, you had Kant, you had all sorts of other people in the late 1800s that were much more popular than, say, Thorstein Veblen, that were already popularizing these ideas. You had all the problems associated with mind-brain duality, and this whole notion that, it's a very, very commonly argued precept of libertarian free will, for example, that when you look at why people do what they do, there's either a self-explanatory mechanism or there's a brute mechanism that just terminates in like they did it, and there's no more fundamental reason you're going to get on the matter. If you take the second tact, it seems that you're more appealing to instinct. And if you take the first tact, that people's doing things or self-explanation for them doing things, it also seems to avoid the reasonableness from the Tao that Lewis would prescribe anyway. So while the more particular talk on instincts, I don't fault Lewis for not knowing, the more deeper philosophical issues like mind, brain, pragmatism, what does it mean to truth semantics, all sorts of other things, those were definitely flying around at the time because it was central to, say, Kant's paper. So.
Okay, Right Ruminations, what are your thoughts on this first part of the essay?
I broadly agree with what has been said so far. I think that Lewis doesn't try to really present the best image of what could be said for his opponent's side in this. If by the opponents you mean the authors of this book, it seems like he is saying in this part that there are no rational justifications that can be sensibly made for what they're trying to defend, but he doesn't really do all that much justice to the arguments that could be made. So, for example, to use the example that was brought up a moment ago with fighting in the military, why could you not just explore the possibility of other self-interested configurations? Why could you not say that, well, you are interested not only in your own survival, but maybe the survival of yourself indirectly through your progeny? Now, he does deal with this later on in the essay, But I would say that it's indicative of the fact that I think that what he is ultimately from the outset trying to do is to say that these rational justifications or empirical justifications don't naturally affirm or sufficiently affirm what we would otherwise know by tradition. But the problem with this is that it it really overlooks the extent to which rational justifications could be made for these things, but it is also meant to imply that Lewis's own traditionalist presuppositions are somehow automatically to be substituted. But it does not. And I hope that I'm not getting too far ahead of us in talking about things that appear later in the essay, but it seems that Lewis has set himself up for failure from the beginning, in that he is essentially doing what he accuses his opponents of doing. He is rationally deconstructing their arguments as based on certain faulty premises in order to pave the way for his own presuppositions, without any steadfast way of asserting that his subjective preferences are preferable, other than that they are tradition or that they are first. Yet this raises the question, raises an empirical question. Are the presuppositions of the Tao really as consistent as Lewis would make them sound? Is there really such a thing as the Tao, or of this sort of perennial configuration of moral first principles? I think that that's faulty on an empirical level, and there's no reason for saying that epistemically, I might agree with Lewis's conclusions, but epistemically, there's really nothing to say that Lewis's values aren't inferior to some newer value. I mean, at one point, Christian values were a novelty. Christian first principles were a novelty. What is to say that say the first principles that were preferred by Nietzsche aren't preferable to those preferred by this or that tradition? And I just think that Lewis is kind of presuming a universalism on the part of first principles that isn't there. And I shouldn't say more lest I delve too deeply into what comes later in the essay. But those are my surface thoughts on this passage in relation to the broader essay.
All right, Logos?
Yeah. Right Ruminations bring it back to the military and dying for one's country as the quintessential example reminded me of something that I wanted to bring up, because when I was listening to this essay, especially for the second time, this reminded me of conversations that you and I, Todd, have had privately about how we'd construct a military and, what how we'd construct it, who would be in it, and the values in our ideal society. Now, I'm instantly reminded of the Bible verse you were telling me about, where the Israelites were going to the battle. And I don't remember who the commander was at the time, but he said, look, all of you people who are afraid to fight, leave, you're going to weigh us down. Do you remember what I'm talking about?
Yeah, it was Gideon.
Perfect. Yeah. Now, this seems to tie into this perfectly, because let's think about this. If the Tao is such a universal human value where all people should just be, default state, we're going to fight and die for our country, why is it the case that some people are so paralyzed by fear at the prospect of war, fighting, and dying, and other people seem to rise to the challenge and they're just like ready to go? Now, if the same people have the same values, if there's some likeness in all humanity, which Lewis wants to talk about, it seems to me that such distinction between the scared ones and the ones ready to fight where does it come from? Now, if you take the hypothesis of instincts, where given the minds of the people involved, and you could try to talk about it in terms of neurochemistry, but maybe not, you could talk about it in terms of life experience or something else. It just is the case descriptively that some people have instincts that drive them to conflict, strength, protection, and other people have instincts more suited for other things, farming, academics, raising children. Don't make your farmers soldiers and don't make your soldiers farmers. I think that was like a Greek proverb. Now, I mean, if this fight and die for your country is the universal value Lewis thinks it is, then this should be absurd. Why would we make this distinction between people? Well, because they have these instincts and they have these subjective values. They have these subjective impulses that make them fit for some kinds of work over others. And we've known this even in natural law in Greek circles forever. And Lewis just glossed over it, much to his detriment.
Yeah, I think this is something coming up that you'll have a lot to say about Logos. Is Lewis seems to give tacit support. This is actually kind of interesting, right? Because Lewis seems to give tacit support to Hume's law of the is-ought problem. So, for example, and this really deserves to be quoted, the innovator is trying to get a conclusion in the imperative mood out of premises in the indicative mood, and though he continues to try to all eternity, he cannot succeed, for the thing is impossible. Now, that does seem to be a sort of nod to Hume's law. Now then, he would argue that you can overcome Hume's law by appealing to the Tao or these transcendental properties. But on the one hand, for those who are the innovators, and I think we kind of know who these people are, logical positivists, emotivists, Hume's law is a very real problem. And that's something that you've talked about a lot, Logos.
Yes, absolutely. And this is one of the reasons why I've taken to reading more discussion about, intrinsic values. I mean, not to get too technical here, but okay. So Lewis talks about like fundamental, like foundations of reason that you just ought not question. Near the end of the essay, he has this quote where it's like people who take an open mind to the foundation should keep their mouths shut. Basically, and that's relevant to this part of the topic here because one of the reasons why this is relevant is Gödel, and Gödel's brought up as kind of a meme a lot and stuff. But looking into him, what Gödel's talking about how is you can't have first order logical systems be perfectly consistent if you're trying to build a sufficiently complex system out of them. Somewhere down the line, you're going to have to input what's called a second order axiom in order to make it all work. So let me explain this. So first order logical propositions are propositions about sets of objects or things. You're referring to a subject and talking about a subject. Second order logical propositions are talking about propositions themselves, like first order propositions. So if we look at moral statements, you could take a first order proposition, something like, you should not kill people because they make you angry. So they're talking about you, people, and your anger. You're talking about a specific person. But you could also take a second order moral proposition that says something like, society ought to have a sufficiently robust set of moral propositions governing the killing of other people. That would be a second order proposition because it's talking about first order propositions. Now, where this starts getting tangled up here is Lewis is talking about the is-ought problem and values. And it just seems to me that values, instincts, all these things, these are kind of like second order moral values and propositions that people just have in their gut, right? We need them. We need to have certain kinds of first order propositions on the table, and other kinds are excluded, and other kinds have preferences over other ones. You can have well ordering about the value of some propositions over others, and we'll definitely get to that later. And people just have these second order propositions. And so that's the ought from which they come from. There's like the invisible one here. But what Lewis wants to say is something like, well, it is the case that we're assuming these things about the Tao, and therefore we're going to ought to do things about the Tao. Now, we talked about this last time. It is the case that we ought to value the dead. Well, ought it be the case that we take the Greek method of doing so, or ought we take the Persian method of doing so? Well, either disagree, even though they have the same is thing about the Tao going on. And yes, the is part is definitely a problem for the logical positivists and most humanists I talk to and things like that. I don't think they've considered the problem very deeply at all. And some of the authoritarian tendencies of leftist thinking we've seen in recent times, they just assume that people ought to think like them. And if they're not, they're just implicitly bad people. Instead of asking the more genuine question, hey, why don't people think like me? What's going on with that, right? So I think that both sides are having the same kind of problem, just coming at it from different angles.
Yeah, ruminations.
I think that C.S. Lewis is falling into the trap that a lot of conservatives, in particular Christian conservatives, fall into. He is rightly getting at the problem that the late modern mind does hold an implicit contradiction most of the time in trying to behave as though it's deriving its justifications from pure reason or from an objective point of view, yet it is by necessity resting on certain first principles. So, for example, if your justification for doing something like fighting a war is, well, it's good for the preservation of humanity, or it's good for fighting racism, at no point are those first principles of, well, is the preservation of humanity desirable, or is racism bad? Those first principles are never taken into account. So he's right in pointing out that there is a contradiction implicit in late modern thinking. But what he is then doing is this trick where, because there is an inconsistency in late modern thinking, therefore his values, his first principles, which came first, are therefore correct. And I think that the real problem is that his thesis would be totally plausible if he said these late modern configurations of thought are implausible. Therefore, my worldview is plausible. That would be a much more justifiable thesis. But it seems like what he's trying to do is to say these late modern configurations are implausible. Therefore, my thesis is correct or somehow beyond doubt. It really does not deal with the problem that even if we take as an assumption, even if we posit as a hypothetical, that there really is this Taoistic universal tradition that really has held place throughout history, that doesn't really say anything about why that should be believed any more than what these modern thinkers that he is criticizing posit as first principles. Yes, it might give them some place of pride as having been there first, but there's nothing saying that you couldn't look at these first principles that have come prior to this modern thought and say, well, I like their idea of first principles, but I think that these other first principles are better. So it is a sort of special pleading where he is trying to say that his first principles are better because they were there first. And it's almost as though because he can defeat his opponent, that therefore his alternative is somehow the correct answer and beyond dispute, whereas he would be much more convincing if what he said is that their configuration is implausible, therefore you should consider mine.
Yeah. Now, once he illustrates Hume's law, he then says they have essentially two choices. They could give up their debunking and then use reason to analyze these moral questions, which he then claims would put them back in the Tao, the very thing that they want to leave in the first place. So he doesn't really spend a whole lot of time on that. And then he says, well, maybe they'll ground it in instincts. And then he's like, well, okay, why elevate one instinct over another if we're only comparing instincts? Is there like a primordial instinct? Is there a primordial instinct behind that? He argues that would lead to an infinite regress of instinctual explanations. And then he also says that when it comes to picking one instinct over another, we have to either say that the faculty of judgment is an instinct, or we have to rely on something outside of instincts. And if we rely that the property of judgment is itself an instinct, then we have a false ruling, because that would be a judge ruling in his own case, which everybody would say that's foul. And then if you appeal to something outside of instinct, then, as Lewis would argue, the entire fact of the Green Book would fall apart. And related to this, when it comes to prioritizing instincts, he says that what they have done is they've taken one instinct out of the Tao and then elevated that over something else. And I'll go to an example that Right Ruminations brought up earlier. The Tao says that we should consider the future generations, but that same sentiment is tied up in care for one's children, care for one's family, things that the authors of the Green Book say is, not really that important. And in fact, he makes a quip that they want to take kids from their parents away as fast as possible. So this is actually kind of a Hegelian point where Hegel pointed out that the problem that happens is when you have an idea, it's in a web of other ideas, and you abstract it to analyze it. But when that abstraction becomes reified, well, then you have a problem, because now it's completely untethered from whatever made it meaningful. And that's what Hegel argues happened in the French Revolution. They took the idea of freedom rather than an isolated intellectual concept to help us analyze its properties. They reified it into something that was over and above everything else, but there was no reason to do so. So there's a lot there to chew on. So what are your thoughts on that, Logos?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot there to chew on. So let's see, what do we want to talk about first? Let's talk about the reification of one particular idea. So I know that C.S. Lewis used communism, Nazism, humanism, things like that as examples about where one quote unquote part of the Tao was taken in isolation and blown up to an extreme case. Well, I mean, Lewis can say they ought not to have done that, but at the same time, you want to look at the conditions under which they thought it was a good idea at the time to do it. I mean, you don't see Nazi Germany's popping up all over the time at random on a Tuesday. There are specific things in that particular time that affect those people in such a way that they feel. Here's a way I can put this. You know how Aristotle talked about the virtues and how you want like a golden mean of the virtues. If you think that one of the values of the Tao, assuming you hold to such a thing, is being so hard done by the situation you find yourself in historically, you might prioritize that value over all the other ones just to grind the pendulum back to center neutral. Maybe it goes too far, and a lot of times it very much does go too far. But I can see why they prioritize one over the others in isolation if they think that there's a particular one that's being very aggrieved. Now, here's the thing. Lewis wants to say they're taking apart the Tao and attacking the Tao in order to do this. But given how internally contradictory, this leads me to my second point, the Tao is, which Right Rumination started bringing up earlier, and I think this is a perfect time to segue into it. Given how internally contradictory the things in the Tao very often are, you're just going to have to pick one and run with it. No matter what you do, one's going to be privileged over the other ones. A good example of this might be open borders, right? I talk to people on the left all the time about how the climate catastrophe caused by capitalism is going to make places near the equator very hard to live. And so the Western capitalist countries contributing to this thing have a moral obligation then to take in these people as refugees and, as part of the justice to humanity. Lewis made so many quotes about the there's no human alien to me. We are all one mankind and things like that, like in his essay. But it's like, but Lewis, you can't just believe that all people are just fundamentally like the same human beings. Like you believe in countries' borders, for example. So it doesn't, so if you go full open borders, like, yeah, we need to bring in all these people to help out, well, necessarily, there's going to be less for you and your children in the immediate future when you do bring them in. So you are prioritizing one value at the expense of the other ones. But if Lewis were to say, no, what's happening to these people is terrible, we should help how we can, but prioritize borders, then what you're doing is you're prioritizing the immediate security and longevity of your country over the openness and justice of all human beings, the left would say. And so no matter what decision you take in many moral dilemmas in which you try to actually act on the Tao, problems are going to happen where one does get prioritized over the other. Lewis has to admit this. This isn't just some problem with modern thinking. It happens any and every time you try to act in accordance with the Tao, no matter what you do. So I mean, Lewis has this problem just as much as the modern thinkers do. Anybody that uses the Tao is going to suffer it. And it doesn't seem like he reckoned with that case Very well. Yeah, Nazism overused, prioritizing one's own people. But given the time in Germany, they felt that that should be prioritized to some degree, and they went too far. But what would Lewis suggest, people do? If your people are starving, and let's do this. Let's suppose that individualist liberalism has gone amok, and people in private property have given up on the part of the Tao which Lewis talks about of justice and caring for the weak, right? Well, Lewis might say it's a Christian thing to do for all of you to put aside some of your benefit and help feed the poor. Well, okay, but in so doing that, he's prioritized the other parts of the Tao. He's suppressed the other parts of the Tao that gave them the liberal private property protections in the first place, because in this instant, here's what he thinks need to be done, right? So I don't see him getting out of this problem. He just wants to hand wave it away when it comes to him, just as Right Ruminations said he does.
Yeah, one thing to jump in here is 2 points. To illustrate your point of conflicting values in the Tao, I think the moral dilemma that I like to always use the Robert E. Lee dilemma. He was in the Union Army, was offered command of the Union Army, but he had a loyalty to the federal government and a loyalty to his people in the state of Virginia. And Lee had to choose. And Lee's not a modernist. Lee's not part of the Green Book crowd, but he had to choose which one of these two issues of the Tao was more important: loyalty to his people in the state of Virginia, or loyalty to the federal government, which he swore an oath to protect. It doesn't make that problem go away. And then the second thing, which I guess we might as well get here now, is does the Tao even make sense as a consistent, coherent object? He even admits that there are contradictions that need to be worked out. But for example, if you look at Eastern thought and even Platonic thought, there's this idea that the physical world is either indifferent or evil, and that the physical world prevents us from seeing the true divine essence of things, and we need to escape the material world. And the Jewish Christian view is, no, the material world is good, basically, but it's been corrupted. And it's difficult to see how such a fundamental difference between the Judeo-Christian thought could be reconciled with Eastern thought. It seems to be almost inscrutable. Right Ruminations, some of your thoughts?
I think that Lewis is just losing sight of the fact that every other philosopher does what he does when it comes to positing some kind of moral framework. Maybe these thinkers in the Green Book aren't doing it very adequately. Nevertheless, everyone has some kind of self-referential framework, and there's no reason to prefer his over that of the next man. And this really touches on this question of prioritizing instincts. If one instinct is to be preferred to another, that's not the contradiction that Lewis makes of it, because you can take a step back, like Nietzsche did, or like Nietzscheans in general do, and say, well, let's forget about instinct on the individual scale for a second, and let's look at how societies function and say, well, there is a kind of anthropological model here that this is how societies generally survive. These are the trends in societies that do have longevity versus ones that don't. And you kind of, over time, just by being inside of that mode of thinking, you start to develop a sort of model. And this is a kind of traditionalism that is opposed to the kind of Taoistic traditionalism that Lewis is interested in, that is sort of more associated with pre-Socratic thinking, that you do find among Nietzscheans, and it really is just doing the same thing but with a different set of particulars. So it's not really a contradiction to say, well, this instinct is more something that should be prioritized more than this instinct, precisely because you can say, right, but what role does this instinct play historically? What instinct does this? What role does this instinct play on a sociological level, and you can sort of glean experiential models on a more sociological level in a way that does justify prioritizing one instinct over another. You can say, well, here's why I think bloodlust, let's say, is more valuable than curiosity, or vice versa. And it's really finding contradictions where there aren't contradictions. And what I would say is that the great irony of Lewis's behavior here is that he is basically rightly pointing out misplaced certainty among his opponents, and then turning around and exhibiting exactly the same error in favor of his own sense of certainty that he rightfully attributes to the people who he's taking to task.
Well, actually, this actually is a great segue to a point that I want to make. Circling back to my Robert E. Lee moral dilemma, what C.S. Lewis is failing to admit, and then, is that as he's described the Tao, there is no intra-Tao mechanic that can determine what the right choice for Robert E. Lee is. So is there an intra-Tao mechanic that could help Robert E. Lee decide? Maybe. But C.S. Lewis has not and does not attempt to provide it. So in many ways, he has exactly the same problem in his own construction as he points out in those of the Little Green Book, Logos.
Exactly. And this brings us back full circle, because most people that would posit this kind of Taoist thinking don't have such a ready-made solution. And even if they did, people could disagree. But let's suppose we don't have one. Well, Robert E. Lee has to make a decision. And if you take a bunch of people and put them in the same situation as Robert E. Lee and say, make the decision, you could have a bunch of the group that go and fight with the Union. You have a bunch of group that side with Virginia. Well, what does that tell you? That tells you there's something about the decision being made that can't just be derived from this first principle. Something about it is irreducibly subjective to the person making the decision. It just seems not only unavoidable, but it seems almost preferable if we want to privilege free will at the center of human decision making. There is no robotic thing making you do stuff, right? Ultimately, people have the free will and they're responsible for their own actions. I'm sure Lewis would like to believe that as a Christian. But if that's the case, then it seems that where values conflict, people then have the responsibility of figuring out how to navigate where the values conflict. I don't see how Lewis doesn't understand this, given some of the other things he's written about the problems of free will.
Well, just to double back on what you just said, Logos, is in the first essay, he says that when you are a soldier about to die on the trenches, you don't even use reason to make the decision.
Well, exactly. That's something we noted.
So for Robert E. Lee, the decision he makes is going to be habitual or instinctual and not going to be one that you're going to want to use reason to solve, because it's intrinsic, like it's inscrutable, like dying in the trenches. And so Lewis would then say, oh, well, obviously the Tao has an answer. Well, it obviously doesn't have an answer, because when the U.S. Civil War happened, there were many people on both sides, North and South, that had to decide who they were going to fight for. Some Southerners fought for the North, and some Northerners fought for the South, who were in the U.S. Army. So I really feel like C.S. Lewis here is not. Now, again, I'm not saying that there is no intra-Tao mechanic that could be used to solve this problem, but Lewis glibly ignores that and doesn't provide an intra-Tao mechanic at all. Do you have anything to say about that, Right Rumination?
On this point, I would disagree with both of you in that I think that Lewis sort of recuses himself from this topic as seeing that it's outside of the purview of the subject matter, in that he does make a direct distinction between these general principles and how they might have to be interpreted in individual concrete situations. He even ends the essay by saying, or the chapter by saying, well, you can't doubt these first principles, but you can have an open mind and be confused about how they apply in individual situations. However, one thing that I do want to bring up that I think he mentions around this point in the text is that he eventually does try to make the claim that that first principles, that the Tao is a priori preferable to any kind of alternative values, any subjective later values, by essentially saying that it came first. And the way that he tries to do this is by saying that because it was the Tao that even introduced the idea of innate first principles that are preferable, that therefore you are implicitly accepting the Tao, even by trying to come up with an alternative. The reason I'm so acting in such haste in bringing this up is because this was the part of the chapter that troubled me the most, because it really is very lazy in that it's so easy to make the distinction between the particulars of this tradition and the basic mechanism. He is seeing a contradiction where there isn't one, because he fails to make a very simple distinction. The simple distinction is that just because you accept a particular model of thinking about ethics does not mean that you accept the particulars of those ethics, of that system. That there is nothing contradictory about a modern thinker saying, well, I accept this ancient framework of first principles, but I think that they were mistaken about what the first principles are. That might be picking and choosing, but it's not a contradiction.
Yeah. Now the last part that he ends with is the sort of consistent innovator, because he says, the innovator's like, well, you tell us that by overturning convention and tradition, these terrible things would happen, and each one of these hurdles we've successfully overcome using technology and our new method. So why not this last residual of nature, the human mind? And C.S. Lewis says, oh, okay, if you make that argument, then, you just have to give up using any moral language at all, and just, and he's like, the sort of like moralizing skeptics, even someone like Nietzsche or Max Stirner would throw them out too. I mean, they're obviously disingenuous. So Lewis is correct that these people are not to be taken seriously. But then also he says, what about the consistent skeptic? And I think he probably has in mind Nietzsche, because in a lot of ways Nietzsche is the consistent skeptic. Says, yeah, we'll just throw it all out. We never needed it in the first place, and we'll do just fine without it. And of course, that's his segue into the final section, which which we'll cover in a future lecture. But what do you think, Logos, about his assessment of the two choices available to the innovator?
Yeah, I didn't really like that dilemma. I mean, it seems to me like what we've been talking about is a pretty good third option, and that's just to admit that people just have values implicitly. At base, there's some instincts combined with the will that kind of determine, like, what people think and do on a base level, the farmers versus the soldiers in ancient texts, for example. It seems to me that you can navigate talk of a base values in there. So I don't think you have to go like full instincts derive oughts, which he correctly points out you just can't do, or we'll just throw it all out. But I do agree with Lewis that the we'll throw it all out part is pretty troubling. I'm seeing, we're seeing some of that play out in modern times, but we're also seeing some of Lewis play out in modern times. We're seeing this really, really interesting synthesis of all of it play out. So it's hard to say exactly how much he was right in predicting what's going on now. I don't know. At this part of the essay, I kind of lost focus because there's so much there trying to reconcile and think about that it became overwhelming to a degree.
Yeah, Right Ruminations.
Well, I would disagree with Logos sort of tangentially in that I don't think we're actually experiencing any of the throw it all out mentality at all. I actually think that we're experiencing full on the kind of ultimate manifestation of the moralistic skepticism that definitely has a very strong sense of what is required for morally upright belief, and I think that's a large part of why it's so frightening at times. I think that a lot of the sobriety in, say, a Nietzschean perspective is missed on late modernity. But in this section, Lewis ends by saying that it is, while it's okay to hold an open mind on certain particulars, that the data or the argumentation is in when it comes to this dichotomy that Todd has alluded to. I think that I agree that this is not a fair choice, that you have a choice between throw it all out skepticism and the Tao, in that it is trying to cleverly, by articulating these points, by saying, well, you have the moralistic skeptics, you have the throw it all out skeptics, and you have me. And then he strikes down the middle of those two, and then says, well, you only have two options standing. What this totally overlooks is the possibility of the honest person saying, I am biased because of my own first principles. I am biased because of my own ignorance on things. And there are some things maybe I have to believe because of faith, other things I don't. And being honest about what do I really believe, which is something that came up in our first entry in this series, and saying that I'm open to the possibility of some kind of moral imperatives. And I'm also, at least hypothetically, open to the fact that there may not be any. And I'm taking an honest look at this. This is really what is most troubling about this essay, is that it is trying to subvert the Socratic method. It is saying that because we have this black and white dichotomy between basically Nietzsche and myself, with this kind of straw man empiricist or positivist model being struck down. Therefore, we can just sort of neatly ignore any possibility of a kind of point of departure in keeping with Socratic ethic of ignorance. This is really either it is highly inadequate or it is disingenuous, but there's clearly something missing from this. I think that it is part of a mindset that a lot of intellectuals have, unfortunately, which is that they want conclusiveness. And I notice that while you'd expect this in average people, what I've noticed that intellectuals often try to do is they try to find out reasons why their opponents' arguments are non-arguments. So what Lewis is basically doing is he's doing that same thing that empiricists do, where they say, well, the data is in on this, so we can't discuss this anymore, or more properly, he's doing what the rationalists do and saying, well, these people are engaged in a fallacy, therefore we cannot have an open mind, or we shouldn't on some level even really discuss further what they're saying. And indeed, he even ends the essay by saying, so much for this topic, there's no need to discuss this anymore. And I think that he's basically just giving way to the temptation to try to disqualify certain viewpoints from even being arguments. Now, you might say that they're good arguments or bad arguments, but he's trying to kind of decategorize them, or rather categorize them as non-arguments, or to decategorize them as arguments. And he's trying to do it on the basis of this choice between Nietzsche and himself, when really I think we do have a valid third option, which is basically the point of departure of Socrates, where you legitimately look at the thing and say, at least on a kind of hypothetical epistemic level, I know nothing.
So, for final statements, it seems like from what I've seen, we are in basic agreement that the mistakes and errors in thinking that C.S. Lewis ascribes to emotivists and positivists are correct. But the thing that we also agree on is that a defeater for your opponent's argument isn't necessarily proof of yours. And second of all, the idea that Lewis seems to be wanting to exempt his own position from the kind of scrutiny he puts the Green Book under is worrisome. Would that be a fair assessment of what we've come to?
I think that's about right, yeah.
Okay, do you have anything you'd like to end with, Logos and then Right Ruminations?
I think we've mostly covered it. I mean, I think I can end this kind of briefly talking about how I see this playing out, like in the modern day. Now, one passage from the essay that I heard that really that really made me start thinking and worrying was when Lewis says something like, "A man who is raised in a moral household and a moral society is the one who's properly equipped to discuss moral questions, and the moral outsider basically knows nothing, so he should keep his mouth shut." That part that part gave me a lot of pause, because it reminded me a lot of some of the stuff that I am hearing about on campus, college campuses and culture. The idea, I'm being inundated with this, the idea that, a white person is born into a white society of privilege and racism, and therefore it is impossible for that person to look outside of that and properly judge the society because their mind's been too inundated. Standpoint theory would say that only the outsiders have the true knowledge readily available to critique the society, and you're just supposed to like listen and be allies. Now, they seem opposites, but they seem kind of like the same thing. What Lewis is saying is people who are inculcated into the moral culture are the ones properly able to judge the moral culture because they are in it. And this is also saying that people who are born into a certain culture are themselves products of it and can't escape it. So it seems like there's that version of what Lewis is saying that I'm seeing kind of being instantiated kind of in modern day conversation, which are it's come to conclusions that are the opposite of what Lewis predicted, and conclusions that would probably scare Lewis if he were alive. Now, I can't help but thinking this is ironic, because what's actually being done with this is it's the same conclusion about indoctrination into a moral society, but it's being used in opposite moral values of the Tao. So Lewis wants to preserve society. He wants stability. He wants to look in the future. He wants all this other thing, right? But opposite that, you have these people on the far left who are talking about throwing it all out in the sense that everything our culture has done up till now has been improper. We want justice. We want more inclusivity. We want more the universal nature of man. And so it's almost taking the same framework that Lewis is talking about with opposite ends of the Tao and coming to radically different conclusions. And so one thing I left off with my notes, Lewis wants to compare his Tao with the first principles of any axiomatic thought. And the irony here is, when we set forth first principles for axiomatic thoughts in mathematics or logic, we usually like those first principles not to lead to mutually contradictory theorems. And so in Lewis saying we can't question first principles in the way he's saying it, he has precluded the Gödel figure from coming out and saying, hey, your system's so complex, here are Gödel sentences we can construct from your system. It seems to me that Lewis would have to reject the Gödelian style of thinking, which is exactly needed to save these mutually diametrically opposed applications of Lewis' system being used in the way that they're used today, that Lewis himself would object to. And so the big, broader meta irony of all this is lost on me. It isn't lost on me. It's kind of crazy to think about it all at once.
All right, Ruminations. Final thoughts.
I think that there are very few things that human beings can know for certain philosophically, And I think that therefore the desire for certainty, or not certainty, but conclusiveness, is usually a philosophical temptation because it usually just leads to bad philosophy. This is why we have religion. It's to provide conclusiveness that man's fallen mind cannot attain to by its own power in most cases. I think that what Lewis is trying to do is to arrive at a particular conclusion, and he is essentially working backward from his conclusion, which is not an original insight on my part, but nevertheless, I do think it is there. I think that his approach is to satisfy his own innate desire for conclusiveness, and that completely defeats the hypothetical and experimental nature of philosophy. And I think that even misunderstanding of what philosophy ought to be at its best is precisely why he runs into the troubles that we've identified in this passage. I'll end there.
All right. Thanks again, Logos and Right Ruminations. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.